Your Royal Highness, Meghan Markle, congratulations to you both.
Thank you.
Can we start with the proposal and the actual moment of your engagement? When did it happen? How did it happen?
The invitation said private. The evening started quietly, and then Meghan did something that nobody in that room will ever forget, and that the palace is still trying to process. The gathering. That was never meant to make headlines. There is a category of private event that exists in the elevated social world of coastal California. It operates by rules entirely different from the ordinary conventions of the gatherings that populate the social calendars of the famous and the influential. Not the charity galas with their sponsored tables and their red carpet arrivals and their carefully coordinated press access that transforms an evening of philanthropic gesture into a content generation exercise. Not the industry parties whose guest lists are assembled with the strategic precision of a casting director and whose primary purpose is the maintenance of professional relationships through the socially sanctioned proximity of a shared occasion. Something different from both of those things. Something older in its social logic and considerably more consequential in its practical function. These are the gatherings that do not appear on any public schedule. They are not preceded by any communication that travels through a publicist, an assistant, or any professional intermediary whose involvement would leave a traceable record in the ecosystem of managed celebrity contact. They exist in the specific social architecture of invitations extended personally, between people who know each other well enough that the invitation itself is a statement of trust, rather than simply a logistical communication. You are invited because you are known. You attend because you understand, without being told, that the ordinary rules of public life do not apply inside the space being offered to you. The gathering that took place on the third weekend of March 2026 was exactly that kind of event. A private residence in the Santa Barbara Hills, the kind of address that communicates its social credentials entirely through what it is, rather than through anything its host needs to say about it. The property sits within one of the elevated residential areas above the city. This is where the combination of physical remoteness and architectural grandeur creates the specific atmosphere of a place that has deliberately placed itself beyond the reach of the ordinary world without making any visible effort to do so. Large enough for the evening's assembled company to move through it with the ease that unself-conscious space provides. Private enough that the mechanisms of celebrity observation that operate with such comprehensive efficiency across most of Los Angeles' social geography had no purchase on what was happening inside. The guest list had been assembled with a specificity that reflected the particular social and professional world that the host occupied. Philanthropic figures whose influence operates through the networks of institutional giving and cultural investment that shape the American establishment's relationship with its own values and its own self-image. Cultural leaders whose credibility derives not from celebrity, but from the sustained, substantive engagement with ideas and causes that distinguishes genuine influence from its more visible but less durable counterpart. And a carefully chosen representation of the transatlantic social world that connects California's elevated circles to the broader landscape of British and European cultural and institutional life. It was not a large gathering. Sources familiar with the evening estimate the assembled company at somewhere between 30 and 40 people. Small enough that every person present was aware of every other person present. Small enough that the conversations that developed across the course of the evening had the quality of genuine exchange rather than the managed social performance that larger events inevitably produce. Small enough that when something happened in one part of the room, the entire room knew about it within minutes. Meghan arrived at 7:40 in the evening, accompanied by a single member of her personal team whose presence was sufficiently discreet that sources describing the evening mention it almost as an afterthought. She was dressed, sources say, with a particular kind of understated elegance that communicates its own social intelligence in rooms where conspicuous effort would register as a miscalculation. She was warm in her initial greetings. She was engaged in the early conversations that drew her into the gathering's developing social fabric. She was, in the assessment of multiple sources who were present, and who had no particular prior relationship with her or investment in how the evening reflected on her. She was entirely at ease in a way that suggested genuine comfort with the specific social world the room represented, rather than the practiced simulation of comfort that experienced observers can always detect. For approximately the first 90 minutes, nothing happened that would have distinguished this gathering from dozens of similar evenings in the same social world. And then something did. Something that none of the 30 to 40 people assembled in that Santa Barbara residence had any reason to anticipate. Stay with us, because the room she walked into and what she needed from that evening is where this story truly begins to reveal itself. What Meghan needed from that evening. To understand what Meghan did at that Santa Barbara gathering and why it landed with the force that it did, you first have to understand the specific strategic importance of the room she was walking into. Not in the abstract sense that all social rooms carry strategic importance for public figures navigating complicated moments in their public lives. In the very specific, very practical sense that the particular combination of people assembled in that Santa Barbara residence on that March evening represented something that Meghan needed in a way that was more urgent, more concrete, and more consequential for her immediate future than the relaxed social atmosphere of the gathering would ever have suggested to anyone observing it without that context. The preceding months had not been straightforward for the narrative Meghan had been constructing around herself since leaving the royal family. The carefully built architecture of a woman living purposefully and authentically on her own terms, channeling the pain of her royal experience into meaningful advocacy and genuine creative work, had been facing pressures from multiple directions simultaneously. Commercial ventures had launched and received responses from the specific audiences whose enthusiasm Meghan needed most that were, in the assessment of people close to her professional operation, considerably more mixed than the public presentation of those ventures had acknowledged. The media environment that had once responded to Meghan's post-royal reinvention with the kind of receptive curiosity that new narratives generate had become, across the preceding year, more skeptical, more demanding of evidence that the narrative was substantiated by genuine achievement rather than sustained by the residual interest generated by her royal history. And then there was the February gathering. The Los Angeles evening, whose contents had traveled far further and far faster than anyone in Meghan's circle had anticipated or prepared for. That evening had created a specific kind of reputational vulnerability that was, in the assessment of people who understood the particular social world Meghan inhabited, more damaging than the ordinary media criticism she had learned to absorb and move past. It had created the impression, in exactly the circles whose impression mattered most to her commercial and cultural positioning, that the gap between Meghan's managed public narrative and her private reality was larger than her carefully maintained composure had previously suggested. That impression, once established in the minds of people sophisticated enough to understand its implications, was not easily reversed. It required demonstration rather than assertion, evidence rather than communication. The Santa Barbara gathering was, sources familiar with Meghan's professional thinking describe it, intended to be part of that demonstration. The host was a figure of genuine standing in the philanthropic and cultural world, whose association with Meghan's work would carry the specific kind of credibility that her current positioning required. The guests assembled represented a tier of influence that existed above the celebrity world, where Meghan's name was universally recognized, and in the more consequential space where recognition needed to be accompanied by respect. These were people who could open doors that fame alone could not open, who could provide endorsements that carried institutional rather than merely social weight, who could, by the simple act of being visibly aligned with Meghan's work and Meghan's vision, contribute something to her rehabilitation in the specific circles that mattered that no media strategy or communications campaign could replicate. She needed them to see her clearly. Not the tabloid version, not the palace's version, not the version constructed by years of royal family narrative management that had shaped the British and international public's understanding of who she was and why she had made the choices she had made. The real version, the version that she believed, sources say with genuine conviction, had never been accurately represented in any public forum she had been given access to. The version that the February gathering had partially surfaced in a context she had not controlled and had not chosen. The version that she had been carrying, sources suggest, with an increasing weight that the careful performance of composed, purposeful, post-royal reinvention had been struggling to contain. That is what made the Santa Barbara gathering both an opportunity and a risk in ways that Meghan, in the first 90 minutes of the evening, appeared to be navigating with the skill and self-possession that her supporters have always pointed to as among her most genuine personal qualities. The room was with her. The conversations were substantive. The social temperature was warm without being uncritical, engaged without being deferential. The specific kind of reception that a room of genuinely influential people extends when they are deciding whether someone is worth their sustained attention, rather than simply in their social courtesy. And then the 90 minutes ended. And whatever calculation Meghan had been making about this room, and what it required of her, and what she was willing to give it, reached a conclusion that nobody in that gathering had prepared themselves for. Stay with us, because what happened next is the moment this entire story has been building toward. The moment that nobody saw coming. There is a specific kind of social courage that is different from the ordinary bravery of people who say difficult things in public forums designed to receive them. It's different from the calculated vulnerability of a carefully prepared interview where every word has been weighed against its anticipated reception, and every disclosure has been evaluated for its strategic as well as its emotional consequences. Different even from the kind of unguarded honesty that people produce when they are caught off guard and say something true before their judgment has had the opportunity to intercept it. The specific kind of social courage that sources describe Meghan displaying in that Santa Barbara residence on that March evening was something rarer and considerably more difficult to produce deliberately. It was the courage of someone who has decided, in full awareness of the risk and in full possession of their faculties, to say the true thing in a room where the true thing has consequences that the managed version would not. She had been in conversation with a small cluster of guests near the room's central gathering space. The conversation had been engaged, substantive, and moving through the kind of territory that the specific composition of the room made natural. Questions of institutional accountability, of the gap between public narratives and private realities in organizations whose public face is carefully managed, of what it costs individuals who exist inside those organizations to maintain the performance of alignment with institutional positions they privately dispute. It was that last subject, sources say, that produced the shift. Not abruptly, not with the visible emotional escalation that might have telegraphed what was coming to the people in the conversation. With something quieter than that, and in many ways more unsettling to witness, a stillness that came over Meghan's demeanor in the middle of the conversation that several guests describe as the moment they registered, without yet understanding why, that something was changing. The practiced warmth that had characterized her engagement across the preceding 90 minutes did not disappear. It simply became, in the space of a few seconds, secondary to something else, something more direct, more present, more unmanaged than anything the room had seen from her all evening. She said that she wanted to tell them something that she had not said publicly, not in any interview, not in any memoir, not in any of the carefully constructed public disclosures that had shaped the world's understanding of her experience inside the British royal family. Something that she had made a decision, she told them. She was no longer willing to keep in the specific category of things that the performance of dignified restraint required her to keep there. The conversation around her stilled. The people in the immediate cluster registered the shift, and registered it simultaneously, sources say, in the way that groups of people register a change in social register when the change is significant enough to cross the threshold of conscious attention. Within approximately 90 seconds, the gathering area around Meghan had expanded as people moved naturally and without any apparent coordination toward the source of a conversation that had changed its quality in a way that human social instinct responds to before the conscious mind has processed why. What she said, in the quiet that had assembled itself around her, addressed something specific, not the general landscape of her royal experience, not the broad strokes of institutional treatment and personal cost that the couple's public accounts had already mapped in considerable detail. Something specific, documented in her own personal experience, that had occurred at a particular moment in the period immediately preceding the Sussex departure, and that she described with the kind of precise, unambiguous detail that comes from a memory that has been carried closely and carefully for a long time. She named the mechanism, not the person, sources are careful to note. the mechanism, the specific institutional process through which a decision had been made and communicated to her that had, in her account, removed the last possibility she had been holding on to, that the situation could be resolved through the private negotiation and mutual goodwill she had been attempting to sustain. She described it in terms that were specific enough that several guests who had knowledge of how that particular institutional process operated within the royal family understood immediately and precisely what she was describing. The room was completely silent for a moment that sources describe as lasting somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds. In a gathering of 30 to 40 people, that quality of collective silence is, in itself, an extraordinary social event. And then, from somewhere near the back of the assembled group, someone said simply and quietly, "That is extraordinary," and the room agreed. Stay with us, because the way the room divided in the 60 seconds that followed is where the real consequences of that evening begin. The room divides and the calls begin, 30 to 40 people. That is the number sources consistently use when estimating the size of the gathering assembled in that Santa Barbara residence on that March evening. It is a number small enough that the social dynamics of the room were intimate rather than diffuse, personal rather than institutional, and responsive in ways that larger gatherings cannot be to the specific human reality of what had just occurred in their shared space. Small enough that when the silence following Meghan's disclosure broke, the way it broke, who spoke first, who moved where, and who said nothing but communicated everything through the specific quality of their stillness, was visible to almost everyone present simultaneously. The divide did not form along lines that a casual observer of Meghan's public story would have predicted. It did not separate into simple camps of believers and skeptics, of sympathizers and critics, of people who had come to that gathering disposed toward Meghan, and people who had arrived with reservations that her disclosure had confirmed or deepened. The reality was considerably more nuanced than any of those simple oppositions, and in its nuance considerably more revealing about the specific social world the evening had assembled. The first response came from a figure in the philanthropic sector whose work intersects directly with the kind of institutional accountability questions that Meghan's disclosure had addressed. This person did not express sympathy. They did not express skepticism. They asked a question. A single, precise, professionally framed question about the specific institutional mechanism Meghan had described that was, in the assessment of sources who heard it, the question of someone who was evaluating the disclosure against their own professional knowledge of how that mechanism operated and finding the alignment between Meghan's account and their own understanding either more or less complete than they had anticipated. The question was asked in a tone that communicated neither warmth nor hostility. The tone of a person for whom information is the primary currency and whose first instinct upon receiving a significant piece of it is to test its consistency with what they already know. Meghan answered it, directly, without the diplomatic softening that her public accounts have always employed, and with a specificity that sources say made the questioner sit very still for a moment before responding. What passed between them in the following 3 minutes drew the attention of everyone within earshot, and produced in the people listening the particular quality of focused silence that an exchange generates when both participants are operating at the full extent of their knowledge and conviction, and the people watching understand they are witnessing something real. On the other side of the room, a different response was forming. A cluster of guests whose connection to the transatlantic social world that links California's elevated circles to the British establishment had given them a specific and personal stake in the institutional dynamics Meghan was describing, moved into the kind of close, low-voiced conversation that sources describe as the social equivalent of a huddle, not hostile to Meghan, not, sources are careful to note, motivated by any desire to protect the palace or the people within it, whose conduct Meghan's account implicitly addressed. Motivated by something more immediate and more personal than that. The recognition that what they had just heard in a room of 30 to 40 people with the specific transatlantic connectivity this gathering represented was information whose journey beyond the walls of that Santa Barbara residence was not a possibility, but a certainty, and that their own proximity to it required them to think carefully, quickly and privately about what that certainty meant for them. The first message left the gathering at 9:51 in the evening. Sources are specific about the timing, because the recipient of that message has subsequently described receiving it, and the description includes a detail about the time that anchors the sequence. It was not a call. It was a written message, brief and without significant detail, that communicated the essential fact of what had occurred, rather than its specific content. The kind of message that says something happened here that you need to know about, without yet being able to say precisely what it means or what it requires. By 10:30, 3 calls had been made from the gathering to individuals outside it. By 11, the number had reached 7. By midnight Pacific time, which placed the information in London at 8 in the morning of the following day, the essential shape of the evening had reached the specific corners of the British establishment whose interest in anything Meghan said about the royal family was immediate and institutional rather than casual and personal. The palace knew before London finished its morning coffee. And Harry, sources confirm, did not find out from Meghan. Stay with us, because how Harry discovered what had happened and what it revealed about the Sussex household is the chapter that changes everything. Harry finds out. Harry found out at 7:14 in the morning of March 22nd, 2026. Not from Meghan, not from a member of their shared inner circle who had been present at the gathering or had heard about it through the social network that had been transmitting the evening's events across 2 continents since before midnight. From a journalist. A British journalist whose connection to the transatlantic media circuit that links Los Angeles to London had placed them in possession of the essential facts of the Santa Barbara evening early enough that their attempt to reach Harry's team for comment preceded the moment that anyone in his immediate circle had thought to brief him directly on what had occurred. That detail is the one that sources describe as having landed with the most significant impact on Harry personally, not the disclosure itself, not the specific content of what Meghan had said in that room. The fact that a journalist had known before he did, that the information had traveled from a private gathering through the social networks of the transatlantic establishment to the desk of a British media professional, and from there to Harry's team, before it had traveled the considerably shorter distance between his wife and himself. That sequence told Harry something about the evening and about the distance between himself and its events that no subsequent conversation could fully address. He did not, sources say, react with the visible anger that the situation might have justified, and that those who know him might have expected. His reaction was something that sources describe with the careful consistency of people choosing words around something genuinely private. He was, in the language of one source with direct knowledge of his state that morning, very still in the way that he gets when something has landed that he has not prepared himself for, and that he needs to process before he can respond to it with any productive clarity. The conversation between Harry and Meghan that followed has not been described in detail by any source. What sources do describe is its duration, which was considerable, and its consequence, which was a quality of atmosphere inside the Sussex household in the days following the Santa Barbara gathering that those with access to it describe as the heaviest it has been since the period immediately preceding the couple's departure from royal life. Not a rupture. Sources are careful about that distinction, but something that goes deeper than an ordinary disagreement about a specific decision or a specific evening, and touches the more fundamental question of where the boundary lies between Meghan's individual story and their shared one. The palace's receipt of the information followed a different trajectory, but arrived at a similar destination. By 9 in the morning, London time on March 22nd, 3 senior figures with connections to the palace's communication structure had been briefed on the broad shape of the Santa Barbara evening. The decision about how to respond was reached with a speed that sources say reflected both the urgency of the situation and the sophistication that the palace had developed across years of managing the Sussex narrative from a distance. The response was the same response the palace had deployed at every significant moment in the post-royal Sussex story: silence. Complete, deliberate, and institutional silence that gave nothing to the media ecosystem, already beginning to process what it had received, and that allowed the story to develop without any palace fingerprints on its direction. It was, sources confirm, exactly the right call. Because a story that Meghan had told in an uncontrolled setting to an uncontrolled room required no palace contribution to become complicated. It was already doing that entirely on its own. Stay with us, because what all of this means for Meghan's future is where this story reaches its final and most revealing point. On the point of no return. There is a particular kind of moment in the life of anyone who has spent years managing the gap between a public narrative and a private reality, when the management itself becomes the heavier burden. When the energy required to maintain the careful distance between what is being said and what is actually true exceeds the energy available to sustain it. When something breaks through not because the person carrying it has lost control, but because they have, on some level that precedes conscious decision, chosen to let it through. Whether the Santa Barbara gathering represented that kind of chosen release, or whether it was something less deliberate, less resolved, and more complicated than that choice implies, is the question that everyone who was in that room is still sitting with. And it is the question whose answer determines everything about what Meghan's future actually looks like from this point forward. The commercial and reputational consequences of the evening are already visible to those watching closely enough. The specific tier of philanthropic and cultural influence that the Santa Barbara gathering represented, the tier whose endorsement Meghan had needed from that evening, did not respond in the unified, affirming way that a successful navigation of that room would have produced. The responses have been mixed in a way that sources describe as reflecting the genuine complexity of what those guests witnessed. Some have moved closer, drawn by the specific authenticity that Meghan's unguarded disclosure produced in people who had spent the preceding years evaluating the distance between her public narrative and her private reality, and finding the gap difficult to fully bridge. The Santa Barbara evening closed that gap in a way that no managed interview or prepared public statement had managed to do. For those guests, that closing was the thing they had needed to see. But others moved in the opposite direction, not out of hostility to Meghan personally or loyalty to the institution she had described, out of the particular caution of people who have built their own positions on the careful management of institutional relationships and who understood, in the 60 seconds of silence that followed Meghan's disclosure, that proximity to someone willing to say what she had said in a room that could not be controlled was a proximity that carried its own risks. Those guests did not send messages of support in the days following the gathering. They did not reach out to Meghan's team. They withdrew with the quiet efficiency of people who have made a calculation and acted on it before anyone could observe the making of it. For the royal family watching from across the Atlantic, the Santa Barbara gathering produced something that no previous Sussex episode had quite delivered. Not concern, not the institutional defensiveness that Meghan's earlier public disclosures had generated. Something closer to the particular stillness of people who have been waiting for a specific thing to happen, and have just watched it happen exactly as they anticipated. The palace's silence in the days following the gathering was not simply a communication strategy. It was a recognition that Meghan, in a single unguarded evening in a Santa Barbara residence, had done more to complicate her own carefully constructed post-royal narrative than anything the palace had done or could have done in the preceding 3 years. Harry's position in all of this is the detail that sources find most difficult to discuss and most impossible to ignore. He is a man whose own post-royal story has always been inseparable from Meghan's, and whose ability to construct an independent narrative has been, from the moment they left together, constrained by the intimacy of their shared departure. What the Santa Barbara evening revealed about the distance between their individual stories is a question that the Sussex household is still answering. Whether that answer holds them together or pulls them in directions that their shared narrative has always insisted were impossible is the question that makes everything else in Meghan's future contingent on something she cannot control. And for a woman who has spent years fighting for exactly that control, that contingency is perhaps the most consequential consequence of all.